Okay. Hello, everybody. So my name is Boris Kalnoky. It's an honor for me to be moderating this esteemed panel. I know one of the participants and another one who will join us shortly. I have just now met Thomas Fazi, your journalist, a columnist for Unheard, and also for contributing editor for Compact magazine. I'll come to you last because we know each other. And Mr. Moustafa, Zeyad Moustafa from the Al Bayan newspaper based in Dubai, if I'm not mistaken. But you yourself are Egyptian, right? And we will also have with us Mátyás Kohán from Mondina magazine in a few minutes. So, gentlemen, I don't know how it is with you. I got a bit depressed listening to the previous panels. It seemed like there is really no light on the horizon. And one reason for that is because it seems to be so difficult to even mention the thought of peace. How to talk about peace is the title of this podium. We should probably also ask where to talk about peace, who should talk about peace. But why is it so difficult to even mention peace without adding that first Russia needs to be crushed, or Ukraine? Let's start with you, Mr. Moustafa.
Actually, I'm always hiding behind the keyboard, so it's very difficult to speak to this much people, but I will try. It's a war, it's a lose-lose situation. There is no winner in all wars. Even if win, it's a lose. So it's very difficult to say that there is a winner after all of this. We know that Russia, as a big country, they will crush Ukraine. This is very obvious. So I don't know how to say, but it's the solution always will be diplomatic solution. The war will not find the solution. It's and even the diplomatic solution have to be very specific and satisfying for both.
So you mean this for this war? You don't say this for wars in general. We do have capitulations. We do have complete victory for one side or the other. It does exist in history.
Maybe the world war. We have even if a company if a country crush another country, it doesn't mean that it wins. There is a lot of human lost. There is a lot of lose in economic and everything. So there is no winner.
So if that is the case, why can we not talk about peace? Why is it so difficult?
It's so difficult because everyone wants to gain the maximum and don't want to sacrifice to have the solution. So this is the difficulty. And because there is a lot of parties that support each country, so that's why it's a very complicated situation.
Mr. Fazi, I get the impression that what Mr. Moustafa is telling us is that we have gamblers at the table who have already lost a lot of money but are hoping for the big win when the next number comes. Is something like that going on?
I think it's a bit worse than that. Well, first of all, I think when we ask ourselves, why is it so hard to talk about peace, I think we have to be more specific. Why is it so hard to talk about peace in the West? Because if you go in other countries, if you go in other regions, it's very easy to talk about peace. And in fact, most people outside of the West want peace. It's difficult in the West, it's difficult in Western countries because, first and foremost, I would say, there's no desire for peace. Especially, I think, when we look at the United States and the United States administration, there's clearly no desire for peace. I mean, we take for granted that the West wants peace, but because it's dealing with this irrational, crazy character that's Putin, who's not interested in diplomacy, there's no other solution but a military one. And if the conditions were to arise, the West would be happy to oblige. But I think everything points to the fact that the US does not want peace. I think if we understand this as essentially a proxy war between the United States and Russia, as I think we should, and to a lesser degree, also an economic war that the US is waging on Europe to some degree, then I think it becomes apparent why there's no desire for peace, at least in Washington. Because in the short term, at least, and in the perception of American elites, even though, as it's been said, in the longer term, it's probably not going to play out that way. But they see it as a war that is helping to weaken Russia, that is weakening also Europe, which is now increasingly seen as a competitor rather than an ally. It's reaffirming US hegemony, not just economic hegemony, but not just military hegemony, but also economic hegemony over Europe. It's made Europe more dependent, and at a very small cost, really, to America. Now, you know, it's been mentioned that America is sending billions to Ukraine, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not a big cost to America. It's got a zero human cost to America. And in fact, US representatives are quite open about it. They say it openly, that this is a war that's working out very well for them. And so I would go as far as saying that this war was not just provoked, which of course it was, and it's already been said by Professor Sachs and others. I would go as far as saying that it was likely sought after. I think the US, to a certain degree, wanted this war. It pushed Ukraine into this war. And in fact, it's not a coincidence that it has sabotaged every attempt at reaching a peace deal. This has also already been mentioned. And so I think, you know, they will be, the US will have to be forced to a certain degree to sit down at the negotiating table. And
how
so
to force the US, though?
How do you pressure the US? Well, this requires a global initiative. And I think it's, you know, I refer to what I said earlier. We know that despite what Western citizens may think, and that is that, you know, because the West equals the international community, because that's what they've been told, that everyone is on board with our policies in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia. In fact, that's not the case at all. You know, we point to UN resolutions, but the fact is that aside from the collective West, so aside from those countries that are under, more or less, you know, under the influence of the US, no one has followed the Western strategy in Ukraine. And in fact, you know, it has increased, you know, anxiety and, insufferance in the rest of the world with this war. So I think what we need is stronger international initiative, you know, from what essentially represents the overwhelming majority of the world. I mean, 80%, you know, the countries that host 80% of the world population have more or less explicitly taken position against this war. Many of those countries have actually strengthened ties with Russia. This is something that you won't hear very often in Western media. And so I think this will only come from a strong international initiative, which puts the US and, of course, Ukraine as well in a position where they have no alternative but to sit down at the negotiating table. It won't come from them, I'm afraid.
And that echoes the remarks of Mrs. Achikalin just on the previous podium, who said the very international forums, which are there to discuss matters and find solutions, don't work anymore, and we have to find some other way of having international initiatives. Thank you so much. But what you said was in contradiction to what Mr. Ruger said on a previous panel. You say we cannot talk about peace because the Americans don't want to, and they don't want to because this war is good for them. Mr. Ruger said that's not true. It's bad. It's not in America's national interest. So, Sohrab Ahmari, what's true?
Well, I think that the war is in the interests of a segment of American society, because the U.S. society is not monolithic. Vast numbers of ordinary people in the United States right now are racked by real problems like inflation. They're out of the labor force, and it's not the political order isn't even bothering about the possibility of them returning to the workforce. We have a profound crisis with alienation and loneliness, where you know, some shocking share of millennial Americans report that they have no friends. We're a lonely society. Working class life expectancy in the United States is edging down compared to even many other countries. Developing world and the developed world, life expectancy is generally on an upward trajectory, but for working class Americans, it's on a downward trajectory. So for those people who are on the receiving end of this, of course they want peace. Of course they look at this conflict and they think this is not in my national interest. It's far away. I may feel bad for what's happening to the Ukrainians over there, but it's not my concern. But that's not how our elite, the uniparty of not just the Democrats and the Biden administration that's in power right now, but large chunks of the Republican Party as well, the military-industrial apparatus. It is in their interest, and I think I tend to agree with Thomas that the U.S. is getting a pretty good deal. It's pushing much of Europe towards deindustrialization. So the United States, if it sees itself still, and I think it does, as an important industrial power, it's nice to only have one major industrial rival, namely China, rather than having to have two industrial rivals. And the synergy between Russia and Germany, the energy industry synergy that was being created, that's now been disrupted. So on a very cynical level, I have to agree with Thomas. I do want to briefly mention my answer to your initial question, why is it so hard? And I'll tell it by way of an anecdote. I was reporting for the Wall Street Journal, the European edition in 2015 or 16, maybe even a little earlier, about the issue of abortion in Nordic countries. And there was a midwife who was Christian, and she was being driven out of her profession because of her views that were pro-life, whatever you make of that. And so I talked to her and others, advocates for her, even critics of her, and I said, why is it that no one's taking her side in the Nordic media? And she was Swedish. And someone said, well, in Nordic countries, the kind of government apparatus, but not just the government, the media, et cetera, maintain what they call a narrow opinion corridor. It's bounded on both sides of what you can legitimately say, and if you veer outside it, then you're a crazy person. Your views aren't legitimate. And of course, as an American, I wrote this with smugly, right? That unlike in America where we have, we don't have an opinion corridor. I was much younger then. And of course, the experience of several recent crises in American history, both domestic and foreign or international, has convinced me that Americans live in as tight of an opinion corridor as any country you can imagine. You can, for example, look at the run-up to the Iraq War. It wasn't just George W. Bush who was pushing for the war, or Rumsfeld, or the Pentagon. It was also, the New Yorker and many, many good liberals. And so, especially now with the decline of the anti-war left, there is just no voice in the mainstream.
Well, in times of war, we have this rally around the flag effect, and I think we have that in any country. Independent thinking shrinks in wartime. Mátyás, if it is so difficult to talk about peace, why does it come so easily to Hungarians? Are they crazy?
Of course, but I think the colleagues have told only one half of the story, because it is, to me at least, pretty clear why in the centers of decision-making in the Western world, from Washington to the NATO headquarters, or to a place like Warsaw, why it's so hard to talk about peace. Because of course there are some nations for which the war is at least not viscerally against their national interest or even in their national interest. But we may not neglect the fact that all of the powers, all of the countries that are involved in this conflict on the NATO side, the Western side, all of them are more or less functional democracies, from the United States to Turkey, or to Hungary, or to Sweden. And for the countries for which it is absolutely not in their best interest to be fighting a war on the battlefield against Russia in the Ukraine, some powers that be have successfully strewn the absolutely nonsensical idea of a peace being Putin's peace, of a peace being pro-Russian. I think that's sort of where the democracy element of being...
Well, is it not? I mean, we'll jump into a later question here, but peace now means territorial gains for Russia and success.
That is a concept I think we have to debunk, because we need to separate, we need to crush this connection between pro-Putin, pro-Russia, and peace. The Hungarian response to this war is guided, driven, and also limited, conditioned by the necessities of Hungarian democracy, by the wishes of the Hungarian electorate. Hungary has a different sentiment towards Ukraine as a country, and has, even more crucially, a very different approach to large power conflict than many other countries, even in the region. That's, in Hungary, the country's democratic will is being mirrored in the decision making. And it happens the same way in other countries. It's just that in the democratic discourse in every other country but Hungary, this sort of nonsense, this garbage concept of peace being pro-Russian is so incredibly prominent. I think we have to make it very clear that peace means the start of peace negotiations. It does not mean the end of peace negotiations. And of course it's not going to be easy for any aggressor in any war to keep anything they have gathered and have it recognized, even more crucially, through peace negotiations. It is absolutely not in Stein gemeißelt, it's absolutely not set in stone that the borders, the de facto borders, the line of contact that actually exists in the Ukraine right now will be the outcome of a peace process. We have to make this disconnect happen. We have to crush this idea of a peace being pro-Russian peace, because then the democratic will towards peace, which I think is a majoritarian idea in Europe, will have free way towards fruition.
All right, and I'm skipping my next question because I think the third one is more logical, and let's not ask how to talk about peace, but who should talk about peace. Obviously, Ukraine and Russia, but we know probably no deal without the USA, without NATO, and a facilitator would be nice. Maybe the Pope. What kind of setup can we imagine?
We have to ask ourselves or ask the NATO why Ukraine is very important to NATO. This is a question that we have to ask because Ukraine is very important to Russia. So I remember a movie from America. It calls Mars Attack, and the aliens comes to the Earth and saying we come in peace. So this is what NATO is doing. They are telling Russia that they are coming in peace, but they are not. They are not, and it's very dangerous to Russia, the backyard. So I think we have to to ask ourselves what is the solution for the NATO. Is Ukraine?
We will have a question about that. I mean, elements of a peace settlement, but who should be talking?
The main player is USA. There is no big country except USA. It's the unicorn. Nothing else. She has to start a trustful relation with Russia.
And Mr. Fazi would say we all have to pressure the US, otherwise nothing will happen. But still, let's also think about the role of a facilitator. Do we even need it? Is it important? Mr. Fazi.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't wade into giving details about who should be the facilitator. I think it's a positive sign that we are seeing more and more countries that are putting forward peace plans. Even what we would have considered until not too long ago very marginal countries like Indonesia recently put forward a plan. And so I think we are witnessing an increasing assertiveness, from non-Western countries, and I hope that will grow in the coming weeks and months, because I think that's the only way to get this done. In terms of how do we create the conditions for facilitating a peace deal, I think trying to shift the opinion in Western countries, I think, is fundamental, because I'm not so sure that there's an overwhelming majority for peace in the West. I mean, what Sohrab touched upon, which is the issue of censorship on propaganda in the West, is a very, very important one. And I think a lot of people are being, largely deceived into thinking that this is all Putin's fault. And so I think the media has a role to play in all of this. I think that, we will also need some support from ordinary Western citizens. We see that in some countries. We know that in some countries there's very little support for the war. For example, in my country, Italy, there's an overwhelming majority of people that are for peace. But in many other countries, that's not the case, Western countries. And so I think we need to. Why is it important to focus, for example, on the origins of this war? We need to challenge the Western narrative about how this war was started, and a lot has been said about that. But that is also very important in terms of reaching peace, because we have to also convince, I think, the Western electorates, the Western citizens, that we are not dealing with a crazy maniac. We are dealing with someone who reacted in a somewhat rational way to NATO expansion, and that means that he is a rational interlocutor, he's a rational actor that can be reasoned with. That's why it's so important to challenge the Western narrative of the fact that this is a war being waged by a, you know, crazy, bloodthirsty dictator who, you know, can't be reasoned with. It's fundamental to challenge that narrative, because otherwise we will never create the conditions for.
Can I add a provocative thought? And I think it was a Cypriotic American academic who introduced the notion of political psychology, and who said that great powers, empires, they live in the hearts of the people living in them. They're proud. So I think that when we look at countries and citizens of countries like France, England, Germany, there is something deep in their psyche where they were once a great power in competition with Russia, and they respond much more clearly you know, in a combative way to this whole situation. I do not get the feeling it's the same thing in Portugal, Spain, or Malta, that people want to battle.
But the mainstream media is incredibly compact in pushing through this single narrative on Ukraine. This is very important to understand. I mean, it's what we saw during the pandemic. You know, a single narrative being pushed across, you know, all major media outlets. Now we're seeing the same thing happen with Ukraine, and so we you know, there's a big problem of media concentration in the West, and there's a big problem of what you could only call propaganda, and so I think that's something that has to be dealt with.
Just a very quick intervention. Thomas Fawzi mentioned the media is compact. There's also my business partner Matthew Schmitz and I run a website called Compact. You can find us at compactmag.com. And many of our contributors are physically at this conference, not least Thomas, I see Arta, Frank Furetti. But no, just very quickly, I think one of the people who should be talking about peace and is not is the traditional anti-war left in the United States and across the developed world. The largest protests in world history, do you remember what they were? On record. It was in the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003. And that is completely impossible to imagine now. You might say, okay, well, it's because in that case it was the US launching an
actually
invasion.
Tell us what happened in the States, because traditionally it's Republicans who accuse the Democrats of being soft on Russia. Yeah. What happened? It's inverse now.
Important shifts have happened, and just to give you an example of it, when a small group of congressional progressives put out a very mild letter calling for maybe doing some de-escalation even as we continue to support Ukraine, the other progressives in the party, not least the one socialist in Congress, Senator Bernie Sanders, rebuked them and said this letter is unacceptable and badgered them, so that the Progressive Caucus withdrew that letter. They retracted it under pressure, not just from the right, but from the left as well. So what's happened? Well, one is I think Russia is particularly it's a bogey in the minds of the American left. They associate Russia with Trumpism somehow. They associate it with populism or national conservatism, with traditional Christianity, and an opponent of the kind of full spectrum progressivism. And so as a result of that, lots of good lefty people who naturally should be calling for peace are at the forefront of being warmongers, frankly.
So there's one thing difficult to understand. Another thing difficult to understand for, let's say, many Americans is how is it that Hungarians are not up in arms against the Russians? They suffered in 1956, they suffered under Russian communism. Why are they now not up in arms against Moscow?
Well, of course, many Hungarians have already burned their fingers trying to sort of disentangle these historical parallels between 2023 and Ukraine in 1956 in Hungary, but I think generally it comes back to the fact that Hungarians are opposed to great power conflict, period. Like that's sort of the Hungarian experience of random international powers who are completely unrelated to our country, who are fighting over issues that are also completely unrelated to our country, then agreeing on partitioning our country or making it significantly smaller. That's sort of the Hungarian experience with any great power conflict.
But does that explain anything? It's the same for Poland.
I would, well, of course, the one great power who was very much involved in those partitions of Poland happens to be attacking their neighbor. So I think for Poland, it is not any great power conflict period. It's mostly a great power conflict where Russia is involved. For Hungarians, it's way more broad. Like we are way more opposed, or
Well,
way
Poland
more
was partitioned by
levelly
Germany, Austria, Russia, everyone jumped in the fray.
Of course, but we are way more levelly opposed to great powers. Like, I think there is sort of a gradation of how much Poles distrust great powers. They distrust the USA the least, and they distrust Germany a bit more, and then they distrust the Russians even more. For Hungarians, it's level. Like, I don't think in Hungary there would be a significant difference in terms of distrust, not in terms of attachment or respect, but in terms of distrust between the US and Russia. But I think, may I just share a couple thoughts on what your original question was?
Sure.
On who should talk about peace. I don't think it's possible for a NATO country to successfully talk about peace. I also don't think that it's possible for the country who broke peace, Russia, to successfully talk about peace. I see great opportunities in two groups of countries that I think should be the negotiators, or at least the proponents of peace in this war. One group of countries is EU countries who are not part of NATO. I think Austria would be a great candidate for talking about peace. I can barely understand why they don't. Switzerland, which is not in the EU, but it's part of the larger European economic community, would also be a good fit. And I also think that the countries who are directly being threatened, even actively, by Russia, with disregard for their territorial sovereignty, the neighbors of Russia who would actually suffer from this conflict being or becoming a more global conflict or broadening out, countries like Kazakhstan, countries like the countries in the Caucasus, those countries I think would have the moral obligation, and they sort of fulfill it, but don't do that with as much volume as I would like to see, of talking about peace. These I think would be the credible arbiters and negotiators and proponents of peace.
Please, Mr. Moustafa.
I just want to refer to one word Matthias said. It was about distrust, because this is the title of the whole situation, distrust. Distrust between USA and Russia, and distrust between the NATO and Russia, and distrust for all the parties. This is the main title of the situation.
Well, thank you for that remark, and let's pick up on the thought you had, Mátyás, that we have to fight the idea that peace means success for Russia. But is that really true? I mean, the main argument why it would be bad to have a ceasefire now is that it will not lead to a peace. It will be a prelude to the next war. Is that a sound argument? Is there any truth to that?
I think it's just putting the dust under the carpet. It's not a solution. It will just delay the war to another era.
You agree with that thought?
Yes, totally agree.
Ceasefire now is rubbish
No,
because it will lead to the next war.
Yes, for sure. This is 100%.
Can you elaborate on that? Why would it lead to the next war?
Because if there is a permanent solution between both the parties and agreement, a real agreement between all the parties, it will not a solution. It will be not a solution. It's just the delay, not a postpone the war to the next.
So people
era.
would rearm and another round of fighting would ensue. Mr. Fazi, your view on that?
No, I can agree more. I mean, I think the notion that in 2021 we entered some, new age of war, I find it, a curious assertion. I mean, we've been living in an age of war for decades, so this war didn't really start anything new. I think but it does mark the beginning of a new age, but in a different sense. I think it marks the beginning of the end of America's age of unilateral war, which has been, even if we just limit ourselves to the past 20 years, an incredibly violent period. There's a recent report that was put out by Brown University just a few weeks ago that estimates that about 4.5 million people died just as a result of the post-9/11 wars. So that's not even considering the previous ones. So we've been living in an age of, a very violent age. The unipolar moment has been a very violent moment. Of course, maybe it wasn't that obvious from our perspective, but that's how it's been experienced by a lot of people in the global south. It's been and in fact, the Ukraine war, in terms of pure, death and carnage and destruction, is really on a lower scale than the post 9/11 wars for now.
It's not finished.
And of course, it's not finished, and it could get worse, and they're doing everything they can to make it worse. But I think I think it's important to understand that what likely came to an end last year was a world in which America reserved only for itself the right to violate the sovereignty of other countries with no consequences whatsoever. And this sense of impunity was also what allowed it to engage in such mass destruction and mass violence. And so I think, Russia's perception of this war also as a challenge to this, to the Western-based order, I think it could usher in, and I think it has, as has been mentioned in previous panels, it already has ushered in, the beginning of a multipolar world. And I think this is a world, or a polycentric world as it's been defined, and this is a world that Russia and China have been trying to bring about through peaceful diplomatic means for a very long time, unsuccessfully. And so I think the Ukraine war also represents, I think, an attempt to force through this change, to force through this reform of the international order, and it's working from that perspective. It's working, and it's not necessarily a negative perspective. From the perspective of the non-Western world, the weakening of U.S. global hegemony. Now, I earlier spoke about how the U.S. is reinforcing its control and hegemony over Europe, but on a global level, its hegemony is weakening, and we are seeing a strengthening and a cementing of other countries, the emergence of a new post-Western international order, and that might turn out to be a much more peaceful order than the American unipolar order. And so maybe I'm being a bit optimistic, but we might look
Mr.
back
Fuzzy.
on the Ukraine war as the beginning of a more peaceful order than the one we had previously.
Okay, but one thing you didn't mention, yes, we have, this has been an age of wars anyway, and we have lived through, many people on this planet have had to live through a lot of violence, but the common understanding that we had in the world after World War II is that we should not be able to change boundaries in a recognized way via war. And that is something that didn't change.
NATO did that in Yugoslavia. NATO did that in Yugoslavia. It created new boundaries.
Yes, but Kosovo has at least, an internal administrative boundary. You can stick to the fiction that we did not change a boundary
That
here.
said, I agree that there's something that
and
this
that
is something
might change. People, countries might attack other countries for territorial gain. Don't you think so?
The U.S. and its post 9/11 wars didn't necessarily change borders, but it just shattered existing states into ungoverned spaces that breed terrorism, mass migration of desperate people, and so forth. So I have to stick with Thomas here. I think he's right. But to go back to the original question of a peace fire, I'm with Mr. Moustafa that, of course, in the classical Augustinian definition of peace, peace isn't just the absence of disorder, it's really the tranquility of real order. It's not just that people don't fight, but there is a deeper sense of order and peace that you're talking about. But that said, in the here and now, when you're facing the possibility of a Russia feeling, for example, humiliated and lobbing a tactical nuclear weapon with all that would ramify in terms of global security, I think just a ceasefire.
Nice word.
That was as a Freudian slip. A ceasefire would be good, and it could be a prelude to the kind of deeper dialogue that would lead to a settlement that's permanent, that may not be exactly satisfying to every party, but it's good
as a step, only as a step.
As a step, of course, yeah.
All right, Mátyás, ceasefire as a prelude to the next war.
I'll get to that, but may I just add one point on Kosovo? Because I think Kosovo, especially as we see it right now in these days unfolding, it's a great example to why not changing internal administrative borders at all is a horrible idea. Kosovo, as it is right now, the fact that Severska Mitrovica and Lepoševac and Zvečan and all of these northern Kosovo Serbian municipalities still belong to Kosovo is the problem that currently hampers the development of Kosovo.
So it should have been divided.
Because I think in Kosovo, when Kosovo seceded, there should absolutely have been...
Have you been to Kosovo?
Sorry?
Have you been to Kosovo?
No, not yet.
Albanians would never accept it. Never,
well,
never,
of
believe
course.
me.
But the thing is, until you don't have that reckoning with the fact that ethnic realities exist and ethnic boundaries exist, until you don't reckon with that, you will not have peace in Kosovo. Like, that is the main issue that hampers the development of Kosovo, and that is the greatest example of why our notion of at least sticking to some kind of internal arbitrary administrative border when we rip out a country from another should be respected. I think Kosovo is the greatest example to why our notion of not modifying borders is a bad notion.
I think we'll get the definitive answer to that view of yours if we do divide Kosovo, and then you see what happens. Let's see if we have peace then. You know, you divided Serbs here, Kosovo then, and see what happens then. But let's go one step further, and if it's our time is running out, so please excuse me. If we don't talk about peace ever, there will be no peace. If we have a long conflict, what will be the consequences for Europe, the Middle East, America, the world as such, Mr. Moustafa?
I think we have to search for a definition to peace. Is it the peace that happens in Iraq? Is it the peace that happened in Afghanistan? Is it the definition? Is it the real definition for peace? It's not that peace. The peace have to be clear. It's no wars, no wars.
So a sustainable peace would require what? What elements would be needed?
Require seeing the others, seeing the problem of the others, sitting on a round table and negotiating about everything. Everything has to be clear. This is the peace.
All
Diplomatic
right.
solutions.
Okay, what should be the elements of a peace that can be acceptable for everyone, and it's clear and transparent, and everyone's happy? The United States, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, Europe. Mr. Fazi, doesn't exist, does it?
Well, I mean, let's limit ourselves to Ukraine and Russia. I mean, I think I have to agree. I mean, I think a clean cut with Crimea and the Donbass is the only way to avoid this, becoming a protracted, ethnic-based conflict that could go on for, an incredibly long time. And so I think that's one aspect of a peace deal. And I think any honest person will tell you that a peace deal will have to necessarily entail territorial concessions on behalf of Ukraine. Also because the people on the ground now, if they were to vote tomorrow, definitely in Crimea, but by this point also in the Donbass, would almost certainly vote to remain in Russia. So, I fully support giving those people the right to express themselves, but I think everyone who's been to those regions, and it's true that there's been a lot of emigration, and so that has to be taken into account, of course, but if we photograph the situation on the ground at the moment, the overwhelming support...
So would referendum be an element?
A referendum, I think, and of course, an internationally supervised referendum would be, I think, should have to be one part of the agreement, and of course, there would have to be security guarantees, very, very clear security guarantees for Ukraine. And this might involve even an international peacekeeping mission. But I think everyone knows more or less what the elements of the agreement ultimately will look like. And I think the really tragic aspect of all this is that we're likely, after a devastating war, to reach a situation where we will come to an agreement that in the the fundamental aspects is not that different from, you know, the Minsk agreement, for example, you know, and so this will, I think, show the absolute, you know, absurdity of the bloodshed and the destruction, I think.
So Sohrab, is a sustainable peace feasible at all?
Well, we must work for it, and I want to give the American perspective, or at least one American perspective. I think the multipolar world that's coming into being is potentially a boon for those of us who think that America is internally very dilapidated. That although, you know, it feels, you know, more carriers than any other country, that it has a large nuclear arsenal, all this sort of incredible military technology, and yet at the same time, our domestic hearth, our domestic home is sort of crumbling. So you have this paradox of a country that can project power anywhere in the world, and yet where I live in New York City, the road that connects Manhattan to the two airports, JFK and LaGuardia, look like anything worse than anything you'd see in Egypt, right? There's potholes and cracks, so that we're sort of internally crumbling. And I think that if you have a United States that's a little bit more modest in its global ambitions, makes space for other powers, realizes that if it treats the whole world as its sphere of influence, of course you're going to have conflicts with any other power that has a modicum of self-respect or wants to revise geography given historical grievances. If the whole world is America's sphere of influence, that's asking for great power conflict throughout the 21st century. And maybe the US can continue to do that, and you know, because of its technological prowess, but meanwhile, looking at home, you have not only our physical infrastructure is crumbling, you know, New York City subway is utterly miserable. It's shameful for the kind of power that the US boasts of being. We're not going to attend to any of that, but we're also, our human stock will crumble. You know, all the stuff I talk about, opioid deaths, addiction. You know, a quarter of the American workforce has to rely on public welfare in order to make ends meet.
All right, so
empire is very expensive.
Dark times ahead for the United States. Mátyás, a previous Hungarian panelist, was asked to present the Hungarian peace plan for Ukraine. You have a go.
Thank you. I think the first element of a Hungarian peace plan has to be acknowledging that our understanding of peace, our understanding of ceasefire in Ukraine is way too much influenced by the failed Minsk process and by the lady who brought that to the table by ex-German Chancellor Angela Merkel. I think we have to dislodge this connection, not just between peace and Russia, but also between peace process and Angela Merkel and her way of transposing the European way of compromise making into a great power conflict. I think you can't make some sort of European Union compromise that works for Latvia, Italy, Portugal and Sweden at the same time. I don't think that paradigm is able to be transferred into great power conflicts. I think that a process like the Minsk process that does not have, as you've said, a clear-cut end result of who gets to keep what, because that's something that the Minsk Protocol has not at all, not even addressed, let alone solved, is not feasible. So my Hungarian peace plan would be similar to Thomas's. I think the Ukraine should have the bravery to dare to conduct referenda. I would be hard-pressed as a person who knows Russia somewhat and the Ukraine somewhat. I cannot possibly imagine that the regions of Kherson or Zaporizhia would ever vote to be part of Russia. No. I think that's completely impossible. I think that identity of being of Russian native language, but also belonging fully to the country of Ukraine, that is a legitimate existing identity. And I think that in the overwhelming majority of the Donbass, that as we currently know it, that identity would prevail in the referendum. Like we in Hungary have the experience of the city of Sopron, a German majority city, voting to remain part of Hungary after the Trianon treaties, just because the great powers at that point let them decide. Had you simply looked at the ethnics, you would have supposed that that country will want to join Austria. It has not. And I think that Ukraine should trust itself enough, that it's an attractive enough of a country for its own citizens who have lived under it in the 30 years that it has existed, that they will give unto it a vow of allegiance, that they will indeed in most of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, probably not in Crimea, make a pledge of alliance to Ukraine. I very much trust and well, basically know
Well, good luck.
that is going to be the case. I think
Good luck with selling that to the Ukrainians.
Of course they won't accept it. I know this is very controversial, but I also think that not giving the people who live in the given areas, who are actually suffering, bearing most of the brunt of the war, not giving them a say in what's going to come after the war, that is absolutely impossible.
All right, well, thank you for that. And we have 10 minutes left, so I'll give you some questions from the floor. And my overall impression seeing these questions is that our viewers seem to think that whatever comes next in Ukraine, it's going to be a mess anyway. We look at it, peace or no peace. And I shouldn't smile because it's not funny. Mr. Fuzzy, here's a question, clean cut, followed by an exchange of minorities on the wrong side of the border. How clean can that be? That's a question. So a clean cut meaning exchange of that whoever gets to keep what kind of territory will be saddled with a minority from the other side, and that would be the root of subsequent conflicts.
Well, I mean, I still see it as a less problematic solution than simply dragging it on. Frankly, yes, of course, that's going to be a part of the deal. But what's the alternative? It's I really don't see an alternative.
All right, okay. And here's
apart from total war until one of the two parts wins, but we know that that's not an option.
All right, Mr. Ahmari will get to explain the concept of U.S.-Germany energy synergy. Apparently,
Russia, Germany.
Yeah. I was surprised about that. Russia, because that's a clear concept that Germany has been running on, actually.
Yes.
So please explain that to the audience.
So for a lot of U.S. strategists for a long time, one of their anxieties about a loss of unipolarity is a situation in which Germany receives Russian energy and in exchange transfers manufacturing to Russia to create this kind of corridor, energy flowing in one direction, manufacturing in the other direction. That's been disrupted now as a result of sanctions.
And that is something that I think George Friedman famously said, the United States does not want to see that.
Correct. It's always been an anxiety, and it's been taken care of. But I think it comes at a huge cost, because I don't think it's good for the United States in the long term, given that Europe is a very important market for U.S. goods, to have a Europe that's deindustrialized and with high unemployment and so forth. But I don't know. From a certain U.S. strategic point of view, it's been worth it, I suppose.
Mr. Fuzzy, how expensive must this war get in every kind of dimension for the U.S. to want to end it?
Look, I mean, when it comes to its military and national security, the U.S. has never worried about costs. I mean, it's just it's just approved its largest defense budget ever, which is, when you factor all the elements in, it's larger than $1 trillion. That's the biggest defense budget ever.
What does that actually mean? If it's cheaper to make weapons in Russia,
Ukraine is a tiny percentage of that trillion. So the idea that this is some kind of unbearable economic cost for America, I think, is a flawed view. I mean, economically, America can definitely continue supporting Ukraine. Militarily, I think it'll become increasingly difficult, maybe. We already know that NATO has a hard time keeping up with ammunition requests from Ukraine, simply because so many ammunitions get used on a daily and a weekly basis. I mean, I read somewhere we're talking about, 10, 15 times more than we're used in Afghanistan on a daily basis. And we know that, NATO is having a hard time keeping up simply with, resupplying ammunition. So the question is, will it be able to keep up with Russia from an industrial perspective, from a military industrial perspective? I mean, that's another thing that US and Western strategists have got wrong. Not only had they predicted that sanctions would have caused the Russian economy to collapse within weeks, I remember hearing in early 2021, but they also said that, the state of the Russian military production is disastrous. They can't produce anything anymore. Well, the truth is that we know that they've produced a record amount of tanks last year. And so what we know is that Russia can actually keep up with the war for quite a long time. The question is, well, is NATO capable of doing that? We know that European countries are already depleting their military reserves. In some countries, there's really not much left when it comes to heavy weaponry, tanks, and so on. And there's only so much we can continue giving, at least as far as Europe is concerned, unless we imagine Europe shifting to a kind of permanent war economy, which is in fact what the European Commission is proposing. But is that really what we want? A permanent war economy, which goes hand in hand with austerity for social spending, because that's what the EU is proposing at the moment. It's proposing a return of austerity, cutting back on social expenditure while raising defense expenditure and military expenditure.
All right.
That's not a continent I want my
Sohrab, you wanted to remark on
daughter
that?
to live in.
Just very quickly, it's true that when it comes to defense spending, the United States is never Ebenezer Scrooge-like. We spend generously. That said, and here I have to cite Compact's columnist Malcolm Cuney and other critics who point out that bloated spending, it's an enormous amount of money and it can do a lot. That said, the U.S., its industrial base has been abandoned for a very long time, so that you can throw a lot of money, but if your industrial base is crumbling, at some point that's going to exact a cost. And there have been, bizarre moments when the U.S. says, we're running out of XYZ kind of artillery, despite all the money. And again, this goes back to my point that actually multipolarity could be, the U.S. needs to have a moment of a kind of reprieve, stepping back so we kind of consolidate at home, build up at home, including our industrial base, which we've neglected and outsourced around the world. So that number, as big as it is, and it's...
All right, just for comprehension, the size of the military budget, what does it actually mean when you compare it to countries who produce cheaper? It's cheaper
and more. And just more.
So the size of the budget in itself is not really all that important.
It is important, but
it's
not decisive.
Yes. Yeah. All right. And we have 3 more minutes. And someone would like to know, is the Russo-American proxy war in the Ukraine a religious war? I don't even know where to begin. Mr. Moustafa, does religion play any religious dimension to the conflict between the U.S. and Russia? I'm not quite sure.
I don't think so. It's not related to religious.
Yes. Okay. What are the participants' views on potentially different regional social media representation of the war? Do they properly represent the voice of the people? Social media in different regions, if we read them, these comments on the war, does that give us an idea of what people think, or is it just a bubble? Mátyás?
I don't think it's representative at all. I think you can get a sentiment, maybe, but there is no social media organ, no social media platform at this time that I know of that is both immune to troll farming and censorship at the same time. Like, the social media platforms that we know are either very gullible, very vulnerable of being manipulated by organized government troll farms, like Facebook, as we've seen, or they're also significantly, very much subject to the censorship of either China or the United States. I don't think that you can get a valid and all-encompassing sentiment of how people think in a given country or region about the war from social media.
A recent would-be president of the United States, an aspirant to the White House, launched his campaign on Twitter. Why was that a bad idea? Because only a tiny share of Americans are on Twitter. So in terms of gauging public opinion, Twitter especially, I think it looms large, but it's like a video game for journalists, But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the video game that vast majorities of ordinary people enjoy. And so I think I'm agreeing with Mátyás that you have to take it with a grain of salt.
All right, thank you. I think we're pretty much done with our time. I don't know how it is with you in the audience, but for me, the big takeaway here is something Mr. Fazi said, that we will not have a peace as long as the Americans don't want it, and they will not want it if they're not forced by essentially the global community of peoples. Did I get that right?
Yeah, the true international community, which is in the West.
So I think we've solved the conflict right here on the podium, and thank you for listening.